Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 65 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on an ordinary room in a police station in Milan or Manchester or any large city. The room is furnished with the usual utilitarian objects, filing cabinets, an interview table and chairs, and most notably, a large window. The latter is significant because the story we are about to bear witness to actually involves the defenestration, I've always wanted to say that word, of a man who's been held in police custody. The victim is a putative anarchist, and the question that we will be asked to judge is whether his death was in fact an accident, as the police insist. The investigation that unfolds in the play is led by a character with one of the most fabulous names in all dramatis personae. He is simply called Maniac, and he is aptly named, for he himself is an anarchic agent of chaos with a compulsion to perform, including impersonating professionals he has no qualifications to be, and who here accidentally finds himself in a position to unmask the deceptions and corruption of the police. The play is Accidental Death of an Anarchist, the classic farce written by the Italian playwright Dario and his wife Franca Rame in 1970. In his time, Fo has been described as arguably the most widely performed contemporary playwright in world theater, with Accidental Death of an Anarchist being his most popular work. As we record this episode, the original play has been adapted and updated by Tom Basden in an hilarious and savagely satirical new version that spotlights absurd realities in our own time. It is currently playing at the Theatre Royal Haymarket in London, having started life at Sheffield Theatres in September 2022 before transferring to the Lyric Hammersmith in March this year. The production is directed by Daniel Raggett and stars Daniel Rigby in an extraordinary, almost superhuman lead performance, which just has to be seen to be believed. I'm extremely privileged to be joined today by both writer Tom Basden and director Dan Raggett to explore both Fo's original and their new adaptation. Welcome, Tom and Dan. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, yeah.
First, I must do proper introductions to you both. Daniel Raggett's recent credits as a director include Noel Coward's The Vortex at the Chichester Festival Theatre this spring, just past, with real-life mother and son, Leah Williams and Joshua James, playing Coward's disturbed mother and son. His production of Anna X at the Harold Pinter Theatre in 2021 was one of the first theatre events as we emerged from the darkness of the pandemic. Dan has also worked extensively as an associate director at the National Theatre, in the West End, and on Broadway, including on shows such as West Side Story and Network. Tom Basden is a writer, actor, and stand-up comedian. He has been BAFTA nominated 4 times for his TV writing, credits for which include episodes of Peep Show, Fresh Meat, and The Wrong Mans, as well as the sitcoms Here We Go and The Plebs, in which he also starred. As a stage actor, he has appeared in Party at the Arts Theatre and in Sydney, Joseph K. at the Gate, There Is a War, National Theatre, Hole's Edinburgh Festival and the Arcola, and the Crocodile at the Manchester International Festival. As if that is not enough, he's also won an Edinburgh Comedy Award for his stand-up shows. So, can I start by asking you both, when did you first come across the play, and what is it about it that led you to think that it could be timely to produce it now?
I think I first saw the play probably when I was about 17 or 18, when I went up to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And it was one of those plays that there are always several productions of in Edinburgh, as I recall. And I think as a result, you feel like it's probably going to be quite disappointing when you see it, because it's going to be sort of, an old classic that's just done to death a little bit. But the version I saw, which I think must have been the Ed Emery translation, which was done immediately after the Fo Rame version, the original, was still really good. I mean, it was really exciting and it was really funny. And I think it was one of those interesting plays when I sort of realized that there was such a thing as a funny play when I saw this. Because I think before that, I'd seen, Shakespearean comedies and plays that were purportedly funny and hadn't found them funny at all. And then seeing this play, there were things that were dated, there were things that worked better than others, but it genuinely made me laugh. And before that, it was only really stand-up and sitcoms that had managed that, really. So I was immediately kind of excited and intrigued to sort of find out more about it.
So that's a while ago.
Yeah.
Sorry, with respect. So what brought you at this point to think, okay, this is the time to do it?
Well, what happened actually was that I was doing Holes at the Arcola, which you mentioned, and the producer of that asked me if I knew Accidental Death and Anarchist, which I did, and asked me if I liked it, which I did, and asked if I thought there was any mileage in an update, a new version, which initially I wasn't sure because I'd never read it in the Italian. And also at that time in 2014, it's such a political play. I was quite overwhelmed with all the different directions it could go in. But I went back to the original in Italian, and it took a very, very long time to translate it, and kind of discovered in the process that probably because it's in a different language, the original doesn't date in the way that literal translations do, because you don't have the same, or I certainly don't have the same kind of intimate understanding of Italian idioms. There's a kind of immediacy about the original, which isn't mediated through a translator writing at a particular time in history. So I got really, really excited by a new version. And then it was only really when we were gearing up for the Sheffield production last year that the urgency of the play really came into focus. I think before that, I'd known and came to understand just how big a problem police violence and deaths in police custody in particular was in this country and in so many countries. But it wasn't until last year that these stories and scandals really entered the news cycle in a very meaningful way that made me think that the audience wouldn't need these things explained to them, that the audience would come into the theatre with the same anger and the same understanding as the theatre makers, which is exactly what Dario Fo intended and what would have happened in the productions of this in Milan in the 70s. So it's been a long journey with it, is a very short answer to the question.
A not so short answer. I'm amazed how long it's taken you.
Yeah.
Dan, how about you? When did you come across it and why did you get involved?
I came across it when I first met with Tom. I'd worked on a production of Noises Off with Danny Rigby and with the same producers who are currently producing Accidental Death in the West End. And they called me out of the blue one day and said, would you like to read this play? And I said, well, actually, I've read it twice before because Tom started writing it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but he started writing it about 8 odd years ago. And it had gone round the houses a few times and had almost got there with previous productions, but never quite got over the line. And Matt, the producer, said, well, it's happening this time, and would you be interested in meeting with Tom to talk about it? So I went back and reread it, but reread a newer version. I mean, I loved it, and I think that Tom's writing is brilliant, but also I'd read a couple of other adaptations that he'd done of other things. And I knew Tom's work from seeing him at the Fringe and on my telly. So that was my sort of entry to it. So I did not have a long history with it at all. I came to it very, very fresh. I mean, the thing that I was surprised about as well is even then the pace with which the political relevance of it picked up over this past year we've been working on it. It feels serendipitous in the worst possible way.
Yes. Well, we'll come to some of the details of that and its relevance to today in particular terms, as you talked about, Tom, how the politics of it has become more urgent and recognizable. And actually, it's interesting what you're saying about whether it's dated or not and going back to the original. And I think some element of the structure of this play, isn't it, that there's a framework that doesn't necessarily date, but that there's a opportunity to inject currency in terms of the references.
I think that's right. I think the other thing to say is that what's so special about this play is the framework is based on the truth. It's based on things that were really said. And so it's not like a kind of Fado farce where it's a fabricated framework and as a result that might date because it's a work of imagination and people's ideas and tastes change. This is based on a real incident and the dialogue is based on real testimonies and real reports from the time. And so it kind of means that there's always something at the heart of it that is true and can't really date because it's just what happened.
It's fascinating. I read that Fo thought that it would not be possible for English audiences to feel the real impact of the play as originally written because it was written, as you just alluded to and will come to, in a particular political moment and circumstance in Italy, but that the English may appreciate it if we substituted some equivalents for those events. And as it turns out, that is, in a sense, what you do. Before we get into the meat of the play, I wanted to ask you, I mentioned at the top that Dario Fo was hugely popular. And this play certainly was when it was first produced in the 1970s. But I dare say that his name may be less well known now. Could you tell us something about who Dario Fo was?
Dario Fo was a really passionate and brilliant kind of incendiary dramatist, writer, actor who throughout his life really was involved with left-wing progressive causes. And he started off, as part of the anti-fascist resistance in Italy. And I think at that time, the connection, as you sort of touched upon, the connection between journalism and theatre and politics was much, much closer. These are all things where people are kind of moving in and out of these different arenas. And Dario Fo was certainly one of those in the 60s and 70s. And he, with his wife, Franca Rame, set up the Theatre Collective, which was specifically designed to stage works that had political currency, that were kind of exploring and exposing what was going on in Italy, because at the time it was very, very difficult for anyone to actually get to the truth of what was happening. I mean, this particular play with Accidental Death and Anarchist, part of the reason for its popularity is that audiences didn't know what had happened. Audiences just weren't really aware of the facts of this case.
Yeah.
And such was the stranglehold that at the time right-wing politics had over the media and over, the supply of information, that it was very difficult for audiences to understand. And so, he became a really, really important figurehead for this movement, and also for the ability to just talk about these things at all. And of course, the genius of him is that he did it through comedy. He did it through farce. And he wanted to persuade. He didn't want to lecture people. He wanted to entertain them. And in doing so, make them understand the link between absurdity and outrage. I guess he wanted to make work that was genuinely popular because people enjoyed it, not because they were shamed by it or they felt like they were learning something, but because they really, really enjoyed watching it. And, I think that's the reason why it's as good as it is, because that was his sort of guiding star, I think.
Yeah, we'll come to the form of his comedy in a second as well. But it's fascinating that you say that there's this close connection between politics and theatre and art in their involvement. He started off with his wife, Franca Rame, in satirical reviews in Milan and things like that. And I read that in a wonderfully apt fact that at the time the police would attend these performances and sit in the audience and follow the script with a torch to make sure there were no departures from the approved text.
I mean, I do that. When I go and see the production now, I do that.
Dan, did you know? You can see him in the audience doing that, can't you?
I'm turning the pages.
Okay. I thought it was all improv. Anyway, there was another fact that I read that highlights the connection between politics and theater and how serious it was that Franca Rame was targeted as a political activist. She was actually kidnapped in 1973 from her home in Milan by a fascist gang. And he was arrested in Sardinia in 1974 for not allowing the police to attend rehearsals. We just talked about the police coming to rehearsals, which again sounds like something out of one of his plays, but it's serious stuff. Just as another footnote, I never knew that he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1997. The Swedish Academy praised him as a writer who emulates the gestures of the Middle Ages in scourging authority and upholding the dignity of the downtrodden. Now, you mentioned, Tom, that this is based on some real events. I wonder if we could share a bit more about what those real events were and how Fo came to write the play then.
Yeah, sure. So the real case is the death of an anarchist called Giuseppe Pinelli in 1969 in Milan, who fell from the fourth floor window of a police station. And the reason that people were so outraged by it at the time was that it was so obvious to everybody that he had no involvement at all in the bombing that the police were trying to pin on him, which was a bombing at Piazza Fontana some months earlier in Milan. And at the time, I mean, the politics of it is so difficult to understand to people sort of coming at it cold. But at the time, the ongoing street wars between the socialists and the fascists were threatening to become out of control, put it that way. And being in the height of the Cold War as well, there was a lot of money and manpower, let's say, being put into suppressing all socialist political movements throughout the world, but particularly in Europe. And it's only, 20, 30 years later that people came to understand that NATO were very actively involved in suppressing socialist parties in Italy and spying on various socialist activists. And part of that was to kind of create these false flag attacks and to pin them on people that the police just wanted to get out of the way or wanted to take the blame for things. And this was all connected to that. So, I mean, I encourage any listeners to go and research it because it is an absolutely fascinating case, and it's very hard to kind of do it justice or sort of explain it successfully here. But, you know, the nature of the cover-up was so all-encompassing and so absurd that, you know, I think this is the reason why Dario Fo saw the theatrical potential in it, I think.
Yeah, so the gist of it is that it was a contrived, orchestrated attack, a bomb attack in a bank in Milan that killed 17 people. And they tried to pin it on this railroad worker.
Yeah.
He was known as an anarchist of sorts, but it was basically, as you say, a false flag, which took years to reveal because of the cover-up, as you say. A trial 10 years later proved it was these right-wing extremists and the Italian Secret Service. You're right. You also said that Fo described his coming to write it as an intervention, an exercise in counter-information, because, as you said, that the media was putting out the fascist side of the story. That being the start, I wonder if we could share with listeners a little bit, the very briefest summary of actually what happens in the play itself. Would one of you feel up to giving us a brief summary of the plot of the play?
Go on, Tom, you wrote it.
Oh, well dodged, Dan.
Yeah, I know. Dan doesn't remember. He's moved on to the next thing. Okay, so what happens is an imposter, a compulsive impersonator, is brought into a police station. And he is someone who is addicted to performance and pretending to be other people. And he manages to escape arrest. But in doing so, he learns that the officers on the floor above are expecting a judge to come and review this famous case in which an anarchist fell out of a window some months earlier. And so this character, who, as you said at the start, is only known as Maniac or Matto in the Italian, decides to become the judge, to impersonate the judge, and to go through the inquiry, the initial inquiry into this anarchist's death, which was deemed accidental, and open up all of the areas in which the police have managed to so far cover up what really happened. And I guess the interesting thing about it is that in doing so, it exposes, and I think in a way that people watching understand, it extends way beyond this original case. It exposes all of the various lies and techniques and strategies that the police use and continue to use to explain themselves and to rationalize what they've done or justify what they've done or even just lie about what they've done. And it becomes an increasingly sort of ridiculous circus as he begins to unpick what really happened and get to the truth, which is, it's then kind of complicated by the arrival of a journalist who has some very difficult questions. And in the end, I'm loath to give away spoilers, but in the end, the police managed to get the maniac out of the way, the only way that they know how.
There's a clue there.
Yeah, there is. And in doing so, preserve the status quo. And I think that's something that was really important to me and Dan, was because there are so many different endings to this play. Dario Fo wrote it and rewrote it, and he favoured a different ending when I was adapting it. But I wanted to go back to this one, the original one, because what it does is it shows you how the system just resets and that these scandals happen and terrible, terrible things take place, but it's away from the public gaze and they're able to just reset and carry on as if nothing's happened.
Yes, well, we will come to the end at the end, but well trailed. I also wanted to ask you, Dan, that much of the joy of the production I've seen comes from the physical comedy in the staging as well. And that's not all spelled out in stage directions, I don't think. So I wondered how you approached that. Did you employ improvisation in staging the play?
You'd be surprised how much of it is in the stage directions. Well, at least Tom gave us a kind of buffet of ideas. I think it's worth saying for listeners that the play is very funny, because I think we talk about it and we hammer the politics very hard at the beginning and then forget to remind people that it is a good night out. But that was one of the most fun things about it. It wasn't always fun, but essentially it's solving a problem. You're in one room. And when we started, we threw everything at this one room, because you're in the one room in the police station where the murder happened that the judge is there to investigate. So you've kind of got this unity of place. And it began with there were going to be trapdoors and there were going to be all these bells and whistles. And slowly, all of that got cut away until it was just about the way the maniac interacted with the police. and everything came from a very pure place of him creating chaos. So really, in terms of the physical comedy, I can't take credit for that. A lot of that came from the original company, from Danny, from Tom, but it was problem solving, because how do you move these bodies in space? How does that best sort of evoke what the story is, but you're limited by the two doors and the table, which sounds like a very boring explanation, but what it meant is that we had to be very inventive with how those were used. So as you know from seeing it, there are moments of sort of, I'd say, pure physical comedy that lasts some time on their own.
Yeah.
And that really came from Danny finding himself in a position and thinking about what the most ridiculous thing the maniac could or would do in that moment in order to unsettle the police or continue to lead them down this ever crazier rabbit hole. And the other side of that, I think, was it has to be grounded in realism at all times, because he can only go so far as he does in leading the police on this wild goose chase and getting them to reveal themselves in weirder and wonderful ways if they completely believe in the world and in the fact that this man in front of them is a judge who is there to conduct an inquiry. So it was always having to draw it back to, because we had lots of very, very funny ideas, and we watched them a few times and go, yeah, but the police would just know.
Yeah.
At some point it would ruin, you're sort of towing the line of believability with them. And if you step over it, suddenly it all becomes, weirdly, what Foe criticised in previous productions, you end up with this room of clowns where everybody is a clown, but it's not grounded in any world, and thus it just becomes this ridiculous cartoon rather than something that is about the interplay between the maniac using the sort of farcical elements to draw out of the police the absurdity of their lies and their collusion.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's interesting you're saying about the containment of the one room and how concentrated, therefore, it becomes, and undisturbed, I suppose, by some of the realities of the outside world that could disrupt the suspension of disbelief or whatever it is that's going on the part of the police there, as you say.
Well, we just at like an example of that. I mean, there was a point very early on where we had a Bakewell tart as a fire alarm and a licorice fire extinguisher, and we went backwards and forwards on these. But I always had this feeling that somehow something so consciously absurd and theatrical would pull you out of the realism of the world, and actually it was about finding ways to make sure that everything was grounded in. I mean, Tom might still disagree, I don't know, but
no, I think you're right. I think it's a fine line with a show like this, because audiences love the physical comedy. I mean, it's the thing you always remember the most vividly whenever you see anything on stage, is what's happening physically. But as Dan says, I think there is the danger of doing things that just feel a bit silly for silly sake, and the net effect of that is you just don't really believe that what you're seeing matters very much. You don't really believe that the characters care, because how can they? They don't kind of operate in a world that you recognize.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, I think, that everything else about it is ordinary and potentially believable,
Yeah.
the characters of the police and the setting.
Yeah.
Well, the form of the play, as you said at the beginning, is farce. And I wanted to know why you think Foe chose farce as his vehicle, because he had, as we've already said, serious points to make. But you said as well, Tom, that you think that the genius is to contain those points in farce. So why farce?
Well, you know, when Foe was first writing this, there's a quote which I will get wrong, where he says something like, it became clear to me as I was starting to write this play that the only form that made sense was farce, because of the absurd nature of the story that I was hearing. And I think he was in some ways led by the circumstances of this particular case and what's being described. You know, there's things in the play where they talk about whether or not the anarchist was wearing 3 shoes, whether or not he could have had 3 legs, and because the police pulled off 1 shoe and he was found still having 2 shoes on. And this is all true. This is all from the testimonies that the police were coming up with to try and explain themselves, versus the real photos and real reports from journalists. And so I think when you have things like that in your story, I think his hand was forced really to make this a farce. I mean, obviously, as a writer, you know, he favoured farce. As much as it was the only form that this show could take, he also wanted to write farce. But I think that goes back to, you know, the things that influence him, the comedic tradition that he comes from in Italy, but also his own taste and what he feels theatrically is going to be the most powerful and exciting to an audience.
Yeah, you're right. He basically talked about the play became farce because it was about the farce of power.
Right.
And the absurdities, he, as you rightly said as well, included, didn't he, verbatim lines directly from transcripts and things. And you say three shoes or 3 legs. It was all true. I mean, so in a sense, the medium becomes the message. But he also saw, I think you said it earlier, farce was popular as a form. And by popular, he meant belonging to the people to whom he wanted to speak and to represent. And he definitely meant it to be accessible and enjoyable, and believed that audiences needed to remain engaged, of course, so they consider any of the messages that he is conveying. And entertainment or enjoyment equals engagement. So I guess that's the formula. I was also struck, Dan, that there's this wonderful dynamic and energy in farce, of course, that comes from, as you mentioned, unleashing chaos in these ordinary settings. And the pace of the show is astounding. It's just relentlessly fast, the language and the physical comedy. And I read, I think, is this right, that in rehearsal, there was a moment that you felt that the show was running too slowly, so you asked the cast to try and run it twice as fast. Why is it important that it be delivered at pace?
It's funny because with questions like that, I don't know it necessarily in a kind of intellectual sense, but I know it in an instinct. When I see a piece of theatre, I think sometimes it can be so laboured and laid out. And I think the comedy works better when it's faster, just as a general rule. And at times we've got too fast. I mean, it's been really, really important. And it's something that we've worked on all the way through to make sure that the audience are allowed in, and you sort of learn you rev up into it rather than coming out of the blocks at 100 miles an hour. I think it's a cardinal sin to bore your audience or to patronize them by laboring things. There's a really interesting thing as well that I think is happening in theatre more generally, which is this idea that you have to have complete consensus within an audience. Everybody in that room has to have had exactly the same experience. And I just don't think that's true. I mean, it's always going to happen that people are going to pick up on bits or miss bits. And as audiences have become, inverted commas, customers, and we've started to confuse presentation and endorsement, there's been this thing where we're less comfortable with problematizing things for our audiences. And I think that can come in form as well as content, in the sense that, yes, it does move quickly, and yes, you may miss bits, but you will pick up on bits that somebody else might not get. And actually the cumulative effect of the whole thing doesn't mean that you need to be spoon-fed every single moment as we go through. That's me sort of thinking aloud about it, but I just always felt that it had to go quickly, that was in the DNA of the play, and that's what made it work.
Well, of course, the maniac is setting the pace. And in some respects, of course, part of the point is that he's ahead of the police at every step. So he's dragging them along in some way, and they're oblivious to a lot of what's going on.
I think that's right. I think dramatically, it's really important that it feels a bit like a runaway train, and that the maniac is just, driving this thing, and the police have no idea where it's going to end up and are just trying to stop it from crashing, basically.
And they can't get off.
No, exactly. But it's also a rhythm thing. I think, as Dan says, with comedy, you feel it. You feel it. The audience feel it when you've got the rhythm right. When the musical tempo of it, if you like, is kind of at the right pace, it's just funny. You get these kind of moments of laughter being like a moment of release almost. And if it's slow, then the audience are ahead of you. And you might get laughter still, but it'll be a different kind. It'll be that kind of theatre laughter where people want to show that they know what you're talking about rather than that they found things funny.
I actually watched a comedy special on Netflix the other day with a friend who has the subtitles on every time they watch Netflix. And I was watching her read the subtitles and laugh at the punchline. She was ahead of all the jokes. And it was the strangest thing to watch. And it meant that it was completely disconnected from the way that it had been so perfectly rhythmically put together to deliver the punchlines in a certain way to allow it to sort of trampoline into the next one. And it made me think a lot about the play and how that rhythm thing is quite a hard thing to capture and pin down. But when you get it right and when you're on a roll, it is just, I always talk about, if you play the William Tell Overture at half speed, there's nothing virtuosic about it. It's only when you play it at the correct tempo that it really comes alive.
Your friend reading the subtitles, it's all wrong, isn't it? And as you say, if you hit the sweet spot of rhythm, then you can almost have rolling laughter where the audience is continuously caught in that state. And also I was thinking, actually, as you were talking about the pace, that, of course, you have these messages, which we'll come to as well, that the maniac is sharing with us that are just passing by at lightning speed. And part of you is going, oh, did I really hear that? It'll be something serious, he said. I wanted to also come back to, you mentioned comedic traditions, Tom, that the form of the play maybe owes something to Commedia dell'arte, the medieval Italian form, or even more modern incarnation, pantomime. In fact, in your version, you make explicit references to pantomime. The maniac keeps trying to insist that this is not pantomime, despite the fact that it contains several of the conventional elements of pantomime, like his interaction with the audience, even throwing sweets to the audience. At least he did on the night I was there.
Yeah.
So it is partly pantomime, isn't it? Or does owe something to commedia, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of the sort of evolution of these things, commedia leads to pantomime, but this is the kind of other offshoot, I guess. Farce is a slightly different offshoot. But, I guess it is exemplified by that idea that there is, in this case, only one character, but there is a character who is aware that the audience is there.
Yeah.
Who will direct things to the audience, who will acknowledge the fact that they're in a theatre. But, I really like that stuff generally. I feel like, when theatre is a bit too literal and it's a bit too like TV, I tend to find it less exciting. I like the recognition that we're all in this space together and that we're all watching something that we know isn't real. But the metaphor of it can create something that's even more vivid in a way. I really like that. And I think it's funny. It's something that people can be quite snobbish about, I think, pantomime or farce. And I think that's a mistake, because I think it can be so funny and it can be really moving. It can also just elevate certain subjects and give them an entirely different perspective. When you're going to see a play about police brutality, you expect a certain kind of evening. And most people probably don't really relish the possibility of that evening particularly. But you give them it in this form and they enjoy themselves and they're laughing throughout. And between the laughter, as you say, there are these moments that kind of really punch them in the gut. I think it's really effective. I think Dario really knew what he was doing.
Well, I think the interaction with an audience creates some of the most joyous moments one can have in theater. There's a real connection, isn't there? That this is a live event and it can't be replicated because, he's interacting and anything could happen in some of those interactions. And as you mentioned, the metaphor, I think, is really important in this play, isn't it? Because we have a sense that the maniac is orchestrating this whole thing when he's talking to us and giving us the wink. He says early on in your adaptation that all the world's a stage for me. I think of daily life as a kind of theater verite, in which the rest of the cast are made up of non-actors who are unaware that a show is taking place. That actually describes exactly what's going on in the play. The other characters are the non-actors, unaware that they are but the pawns being directed by him, with us as the audience, and he's creating this bond with us. We are aligned with him in watching him skewer the unwitting policemen who play it completely straight. It's interesting you said that in your version, it's only the maniac, I think I'm right in saying, who actually recognizes the audience. The others don't. But I've seen other versions where I think other characters do, and I'm not sure that works as well. I think the fact that the maniac is the one is spot on.
Yeah, I can't say for certain, but I'm pretty sure it's only the maniac and the foe that is aware of the audience. I'm pretty sure. I may be wrong about that, but I certainly felt like it was important. I've seen versions like that too. Like in the Gavin Richards version, all of the characters are constantly talking to the audience and sort of walking on and off the set. I personally feel like the effect is that you just sort of disengage from the story and the world quite quickly. As Dan was saying earlier, we were very committed to the idea that the policeman and the journalists, all of the characters around the maniac, think that this is real life, think that this is real, the stakes are real, their jobs are on the line. And the maniac is aware that he's putting on a performance in a theatre.
Yeah. Another feature of pantomime is that it contains references to things that are current in our world today, as this does. And I wondered, I think we touched on this at the beginning, is that did Faux intend, do you think, that future productions of the play would allow for this kind of updating? And are you still updating? I mean, you mentioned that when you started in 2014 and then a year ago, I mean, there are references to, Elon Musk and WhatsApp and also, of course, very specific things that are in the news even now. Are you still doing that, updating that as we go?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, we were updating a lot, but particularly between Sheffield and the Lyric Hammersmith, because so many news stories broke about the Metropolitan Police. And we changed our focus to be exclusively about the Met Police rather than UK policing in general. So we were updating a lot at that point. And now that we've opened, I don't want the actors to sort of hate me too much. So we try and limit the kind of updates that we put in there.
There's a wonderfully absurd theatrical moment at the end of Act 1 that continues at the start of Act 2, when the maniac has somehow persuaded all of the policemen to join him in singing together, which is, I suppose, another element of commedia or pantomime, maybe. Tell us a bit about what that crazy scene is all about. Why the music and what are they singing? Is this part of the original, Dan? Do you know?
I don't know if it's in the original, but it was certainly in my original, which is Tom's version, that at the end of the first act there, he sort of corralled them into attempting to sing. And then when we see them again at the beginning of the second act, there's a slight time shift to a bit later, and they've somehow learned how to sing in beautiful harmony. Is that in the original, Tom?
Yeah, that is in the original, that they're learning. What is it? It's Mia Patria il mondo il toro. They're learning My Country is the Whole World, which is a sort of communist anthem that he's teaching to the police.
So that's deeply ironic. He has the police singing the communist anthem.
Yeah, completely. But then Bella Ciao is similarly a sort of, it's an anthem of anti-fascist resistance in the 70s, and it's linked to the Risorgimento in the 1860s. So it's kind of got a long political history. It's also just a beautiful song, and it's become more widely known in recent years through various protest movements using it, and like Occupy Wall Street was singing it, and then they were singing it in Athens and Rome. It's one of those songs that has a nice kind of political history as well as being just a beautiful operatic number.
I wanted to ask about the character of the maniac. And I mentioned Commedia dell'arte. He is a bit like the Harlequin in Commedia. Is that going too far? It's a character, I believe, that, like the Harlequin, was created by the actor, often improvising. And I believe Faux himself played him in the first production. So he owes something to that, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. I think that character, as you say, the Harlequin's jester, Arlecchino, as he's known in Commedia, is absolutely the basis for this character. And a bit like the fool in Shakespeare, it's invariably a character who will always find a way to get to the truth. They will always say something that the others aren't able to or willing to say. But because they have no status at all in this world, they have a freedom to express themselves.
Ah, yes.
So there's nothing at stake for them. And that's what, allows them to be so disruptive. So there's certainly a kind of, long tradition of that in theatre, yeah.
I thought what was interesting is about his madness. I mean, he's self-proclaimed mad, but actually it's just a theatrical lunacy, isn't it? It's a bit, as you say, like the fool in Shakespeare. We know he's smarter than anyone else. Completely,
but I think the idea of the play really is that people who are genuinely aware of the truth are deemed as mad.
Aha.
Because when you're in a world that is completely constructed, in which everyone is playing a role which is arbitrarily assigned but is of intense importance, then people who can see through that, like with, say, The Emperor's New Clothes or something, people who can see the truth behind it all are seen as mad. They're outcast.
Yes, there is the essential paradox, isn't there, that the ostensible lunatic exposes the mad logic of the supposedly sane people, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
And when you talk about the fool, that actually reminds me also about the language that the maniac speaks with. He speaks at amazing speed, as we said earlier, Dan, which seems to fly over the heads of the other characters. So there's dramatic irony at work, isn't there, in his use of language?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of dramatic irony in what the maniac is saying, because obviously he has a level of awareness that is slightly supernatural. And that's grounded in the fact that he is able to see the truth of the theatre that they're in. And so he is able to ask questions or elicit things or become aware of things with astonishing speed and insight, which yes, I guess it's always possible. There's a really lovely moment that Danny Rigby improvised, but I think it's really lovely because it touches on this, where he is trying to speak to the fourth floor on the phone and he just kind of mashes the keys with his hand, and then he says, is that the fourth floor? Oh, that's lucky. And the idea being that he just happens to hit upon the right button to get him to the fourth floor. And I think that's kind of the maniac's relationship with reality in this show, that everything is possible, but his relationship with it is heightened, is kind of slightly absurd.
Again, like the fool in Shakespeare, sometimes he speaks so quickly, but also with a sophistication in a way and an intelligence that's almost like riddles that the others just don't get.
Yeah.
The way the fool speaks in riddles that the others are trying to figure out, but he's skewering the truth in so doing. It jumps out at you if you listen carefully. And listening carefully is important too, isn't it? Because the maniac's language is very precise, which is also, of course, one of the thematic points, that he's calling the others on their lack of precision in language, because, of course, the accuracy of things like police testimonies is all important. It's the words that count. And they're making it all up and it's a little bit vague and not precise. And in fact, there's a point where he points out the difference between trapped and entrapped, which is, of course, material to the plot, but also lovely kind of distinction in linguistic terms, which they don't really get.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting relationship between the artist and the state in that way, that I guess the thing about the police is it's the state's monopoly on violence, basically. That there's a last resort, the state can always enforce things with violence through the police. And all that artists have, the only weapons that they have are words. And therefore, you've got to be very, very careful with your words, and you've got to use them as persuasively or as insightfully as you can. And in that way, you can see why Dario Fo was the one who would play the maniac. And as you say, it speaks to that extremely interesting and troubling story of him being spied upon by the police during production, or police coming in and watching his rehearsals, that they were terrified of him. They were terrified of his words. And it's really, really wonderful to remember that.
Yes. I mean, you talk about the police violence. There are numerous targets of satire in the play, the primary target being the police, and all sorts of aspects about their behavior, including violence, misogyny, prejudice, lying, police funding even. And throughout, the maniac quotes real statistics from our world, such as 25% cut in police funding, or that 1,861 people have died in police custody or following contact with the police in the UK since 1990. That figure may even be different from the night I saw it.
It is, yeah. It is different.
I think that comes as a real shock to most people in the audience, doesn't it?
I'd hope so. That figure is different, actually. That's gone up by another 2 since you saw the show.
Wow.
I mean, I think one of the big things about it is that it is a problem that, particularly in this country, we're not cognizant of. I think most people assume that the status quo protects them, that the police are there to sort of enforce or uphold a system that, I guess, serves the most peaceful way in which society can operate. And actually, the reality of it is, or that we're becoming much more aware of, I think maybe that's a bit of an old-fashioned thought now, and there's a lot more awareness about I suppose the inherent systemic violence in what goes on. I mean, since we started working on the play last September, so not even a year, in Sheffield, there have been 29 further deaths in police custody. And since we started on the Haymarket only a matter of months ago, there are 8 more of those. So the death toll keeps rising.
We don't hear this. We never hear about this, do we?
Well, you do if you come and see Accidental Death of an Anarchist at the Haymarket.
Well, there you go. That's the point of art.
Well, I'd hope so. But it also comes back to, I mean, we looked at a lot of real police testimonies when we were in rehearsals. And it's fascinating. It's what you talk about the language, where what the maniac has that also we as the audience don't have is this sort of almost depth of vision, or is able to pull together in a way that Tom has rather brilliantly orchestrated into one person, an understanding of the full context of what this means, which the police just don't. And the same is true in real life, in the sense that they will quite happily, and this is a system that they use when they're making statements about big events, when somebody has been killed by a police officer, the police officers will sit in the same room with a whiteboard and they will do their statements collectively. And that is a commonly accepted way of doing it. And so when the inquiries come about and they go, but hang on, isn't that completely antithetical to the way you would do it with a normal witness? The answer is yes, but the comprehension is still a no, because that's the way the system's always worked. In the same way that if a police officer kills somebody, they're treated not as a suspect, but as a witness. There's no sense that they have taken another human life or murdered somebody. It's a completely different use of language, it's a different set of rules when it's, I would say, state-sponsored violence.
Interesting. I mean, yes, you're going back to Fo's context. Not so different, is it? That when you were talking earlier, Tom, I think it was the suggestion that it wasn't just a specific event here, obviously. It was about the interconnectedness of the police and the state and the whole system and the institutions that are, as you say, charged with preserving this status quo and the force required to do so.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, I think in recent years, there have been incidences that really bring this to light, like how the police behave towards peaceful protesters, or how the police behave towards people who are not in favour of their royal family on the day of a coronation. These are things that, they're basic human rights that democracies have, that grant people, that we have a right to express our dissatisfaction with the most powerful people in our country, or most powerful institutions. But obviously, those institutions don't like that. And those institutions become, their relationship with the police has become increasingly muddy and compromised. And I think these are things that, while our political situation now is very, very different from what was happening in Italy in the 60s and 70s. It's important to say that it's very different. The drift towards, I guess, legislation that smacks of control or authoritarianism or shutting down peaceful or even sort of artistic dissent is interesting and really worrying. And I think that the police's role in that is something that is increasingly going to have to be under scrutiny. And I feel like, for me, that's the most relevant thing about this production right now, because I think the deaths in police custody since 1990, this has been going on for a very, very long time. And this is a problem that some communities in this country understand intimately and have been outraged and furious about for decades now. And the wider public are only really coming to understand now through specific cases. But I think the more live question, the thing that's really taken form in the last few years, is about how the police are expected to enact preferential policies from ruling parties rather than uphold our rights and our freedoms.
Fascinating. It just occurs to me while you're speaking as well that the theatre becomes part of our scrutiny, partly because, and goes back again to Foe's original circumstances, that the media is pretty constricted in lots of ways. We know where the media line lies in a lot of cases, and that the powers that dominate our media are pretty predictable in their alignment with status quo, for example. And just in passing, there are all sorts of targets for the satire in the play, which I think is beautifully done, by the way, Tom. It's not heavily loaded. It's just very delicately inserted, I think, a number of these targets. The Catholic Church, or stop the boats, judges being too old, but also one was inquiries, public inquiries that just keep repeating themselves and don't end up with any real change, that actually don't resolve or get to anybody being accountable.
Or worse still, they just exonerate the policemen involved. You know, really with public inquiries, I think what we've seen is it just depends on the amount of pressure that the inquiry is under. And if the inquiry is under no pressure at all, it will usually take the path of least resistance and exonerate the policemen involved.
So here's a question for you both. So we started at the beginning of talking about this as farce, and we talked about how Foe intended that serious points be made in this format. Do you think that the serious political points land if it's a night, as you quite rightly emphasized, of fantastic enjoyment, very, very funny? Do people leave this theater with their minds changed in some way?
Go on, Dan, what do you think?
Well, I'd hope so. I was going to quote your mum, actually, who came to see it. And then I saw her a couple of days later and she said, well, I just keep thinking about lines in the play. I think things pop into my head, or I'll be in a situation where there'll be a turn of phrase and I'll hear it and it'll make me think of something to do with the play. And then from that, I'll go from maybe one of the jokes to one of the facts. And I hope it beds something. I mean, Foe talks about laughter not allowing a catharsis and keeping this seed of anger inside you. And so I do hope that that's the case. I mean, I think the power of it is that it's popular, and so you remember it because you enjoyed it, and it doesn't allow you to wipe clean. Hopefully it doesn't allow this sort of theatre as medicine thing, which I see a lot, where people go and they go, well, I've seen a very important play about a very important issue, so I've kind of done the job now and I don't need to worry about continuing to think about it or doing anything active. I mean, I think it's worth saying that one of the bits of genius of Tom's adaptation is that, as you pointed out, we're all to blame. You know, I think of myself as part of that system as well. I have to fight very hard against this idea that, you know, the status quo currently serves me quite well.
Yeah.
And so is it in my interest to actually do anything to change or shift it, or to even give it that much thought on a day-to-day basis? And working on the play has challenged me to try and do that more. And I think it should. And I think one of the problems that theatre has quite a lot is what it says to its audience is, by coming to see this, you've taken your medicine and you can now leave with the balm of being an inverted commas good person. And hopefully we don't do that. Hopefully there's enough in there that it, if nothing else, I think, as our conversation sort of about the sheer statistics of it points to, people don't know that this death toll following contact with the police is creeping up and has been for many years, and it's continuing to happen right under our nose. So hopefully, if nothing else, people at least go away with that, but perhaps with a little bit more of a questioning attitude towards the societal foundations that we just accept as the way that things, inverted commas, work.
I think that the thing about comedy is that you have to listen carefully, because if you don't, you're not going to enjoy it and you're going to miss things. And particularly comedy that's going fast, it requires an audience to really concentrate. And it's enjoyable concentration. You're keyed into it. And I think that's just such an ideal time to tell people a few home truths about whatever subject you might be discussing. And I think that's a big part of the reason that Faux does it, because it's like constantly throwing sweets at people and people having their mouths open to receive these sweets. And it means that you can get some vegetables in as well because they've got their mouths open. Whereas if you go and see a play that's very po-faced and somber and just presenting shocking or sad information to people, honestly, I think people just stop listening. I regret to say that I think it's just not the way that people are inspired to engage with things. I think there has to be something in it for them. I think that they have to feel something connective about what they're watching, rather than just watching the news, basically.
I think you walk this tightrope beautifully in terms of the tone and the intent, and that people are, as you say, they are listening carefully. They are engaged, going back to Faux saying they'd be engaged. And there was a quote, as you mentioned, Dan, that Faux thought about laughter as leaving a sediment of anger inside you. And you mentioned catharsis, and he was against the idea that you purged all your feelings in the theater and then walked out clean in some way, that you want to retain a sense of indignation when you leave the theater. I also thought, actually, it came to me that laughter is fundamentally liberating. And if we're talking about behavior in response to the status quo, then it needs to be individuals liberating themselves from the status quo. Laughter is an expression of individual freedom, is it not? It's iconoclastic even by definition in some ways, which is clearly an attitude he would want to provoke in general, I would suggest.
That's right. I'm pretty sure that in Belarus that about 10, 15 years ago, Lukashenko made it illegal for people to laugh outside Parliament. Well, I say Parliament, outside his palace,
Oh, my God.
And equally illegal to applaud. And it's really interesting that these are things associated with, comic performance, because if you're laughing, if you're applauding, then not only is it, as you say, an expression of agency on the part of the viewer, that even if it seems to be in support of something, it's an expression of freedom. It's an expression of like people's choice to interpret things their way. And I think that's very powerful.
It's interesting. You always do have that image that any autocrat hates most is being laughed at.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, we're coming to the end, and I wanted to circle back, Tom, where you nearly started, which was the ending of the play. Because as you mentioned, I think Faux himself changed it at least once, and there have certainly been different treatments in previous English adaptations I've looked at. And again, at the risk of spoilers, I wanted to ask you what the ending that you used, what it says as a sort of culmination, if there is one, of the play. Because just describe a little bit about what happens at the end of your version, if you would.
So I will, and people should skip this bit if they plan to come and see the show in the immediate future. But what happens is that the maniac threatens to set off a replica of the bomb that was brought in by another police officer. And he makes the police chain themselves to the radiator with the journalist. And at the point that he's about to set it off, the lights mysteriously go out. And we hear screams from the maniac. And then when the lights come back on, he's disappeared and the window's open. And the journalist is able to wriggle out of the cuffs and goes to check and finds that the maniac has fallen from the window, at which point the police protest their innocence because they were handcuffed to the radiator. It couldn't possibly have been them. The journalist accepts this and also decides that she's going to reevaluate what happened in the previous case in light of this, and leaves. And then the police produce keys from their pockets and unlock themselves, demonstrating that they kind of could have done that during the blackout as well. And just as the police think that it's all gone away and they've dealt with everything, there's a mysterious stranger at the door who looks exactly the same as the maniac, but in a different costume, different hair. They assume is the maniac and they start beating him up, and then he reveals himself to be the real judge. And in our version, this real judge kind of indicates to the audience at the very end that he is still the maniac.
Yes.
But there's a degree of ambiguity about that. We never really spell that out. But I think that the idea with the ending is that for the police, normal service is resumed. They've managed to clear their name. They've managed to explain away or cover up yet another fatality. But for the maniac, for the artist, if you like, they will still hold them to account. They will still find a way to reappear and plague them, keep probing them and trying to find the truth.
I love the idea of the maniac as the artist, who's one of the champions of truth, who's never going to give up.
Yeah.
As you explained, that in a sense, he's almost recreating the circumstances of the anarchist death, of course, and all of its ambiguity about who was responsible for his defenestration. Did he choose to go out the window himself? Was he just driven to it by the actions of the police, or literally pushed out the window? All those options are still just held there as possibilities. But then again, I love the idea, as you say, that the maniac, the actor playing the maniac, comes back dressed as the judge and starts again to initiate another inquiry. And he, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he turns to the audience and says, let's go back to the beginning, shall we? So the whole cycle is going to repeat itself.
Yeah.
So as you say, the artist is not giving up. He will keep probing, but also the cycle starts again in terms of scandal, corruption, cover-ups, inquiries endlessly repeating themselves. That's part of the point.
And I think when this play has been performed internationally and in different translations and keeps on being performed in different productions, I think it sort of has a slightly different resonance now as well, which is like iterations of this play will keep reappearing, which is a nice nod to the original. I mean, we kind of referenced the original version a couple of times in our production. That I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a cycle that's been going on and off stage for 50 odd years.
That's a wonderful note to stop on, because it's just the idea that this play will always be relevant. Thank you both so much for your time today. Before I let you go, there is one more thing I need from you. One of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might do in the podcast, or that is just a personal favorite. So do you have a favorite you'd like to volunteer? I know it's hard to choose just one.
You go first, Dan.
I'm going to go, because that's like trying to pick my favorite child if I had kids, which I don't, and I wouldn't pick a favorite, that is. But two things that are playing now, which I've seen recently, which I think are very interesting for different ways. I think Dear England at the National Theatre, I think simply because I get excited by it as a piece of modern myth making, and the idea of taking a story that is so much within the national psyche and sort of taking us behind closed doors with it, I think is a very interesting thing to do. But then, I mean, my favorite thing that I've seen recently is actually musical. I don't know if that's allowed, but it's A Strange Loop at the Barbican, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I love theatre that recognises its theatre. And it's a kind of mise en abîme of a musical that is very much about one person's personal journey. And through that becomes a huge musing on identity. And it's just got really cracking tunes in it. I absolutely loved it. I think it's one of the most original and exciting things I've seen in a long time.
Oh, great. Great recommendation. I must go and see it. And Dear England's fascinating, as you say, because it attempts to be a reflection of some kind about Englishness, patriotism, what our notion of what England is, reflected through the prism of the English football team. And as you say, how we make myths about that and ourselves. How about you, Tom?
So I would recommend The Effect by Lucy Prebble, which is on again at the National. It's just a great play, and it's really theatrical and interesting. One of my favourite plays of recent times.
I'm very much looking forward to The Effect as well. I saw it when it came to the National the last time, and it's a fascinating piece. Thank you both. It's been a joy to talk about this joyous play with you. Tom and Dan's adaptation of Accidental Death of an Anarchist runs at the Theatre Royal Haymarket in London until the 9th of September. Go for an hilarious night out and for a healthy dose of indignation. As the curtain falls on the judge and his exhortation that we go back and start again, do we become complicit in allowing the stories of scandal to repeat themselves? That we accept the official accounts that we're presented with, accounts that are filled with alternative facts that resemble, in fact, the form of dramatic fiction? Perhaps in so doing, we accept the idea that anyone who challenges the status quo is a dangerous anarchist or even mad. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy exclusive access to the play review, bonus episodes in which I review current productions that I see in my regular theater going. To become a patron, visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at The Play Pod and on Instagram at The Play Podcast. Thank you again for listening and for your support. See you next time.